fascinating discussion over what must be one of the most salient military and political events, the war in Gaza. And depending on how you frame that, you can paint that conflict in many ways. Is it a high-scale war between combatants in which, whichever way you cut it, there will be collateral damage and civilian casualties, or is it an extended counterinsurgency campaign which would cause you to look at it through a different lens? And so straight away the politics and the military element of it get mixed, get confused, and no wonder the debate is as strong and powerful and all-encompassing as it is at the moment. To help us unravel it, we have two excellent speakers in conversation this morning. Our guest from America is Professor John Spencer. He's the Chair of Urban Warfare at the Modern War Institute, which is the US Military Academy's think tank. Professor John served in the US Army for 25 years, including 2 tours in Iraq, where no doubt he saw at the sharp end the harsh realities of urban warfare. He's made that his special subject of research since, and indeed the mini manual for the urban defender, primer on urban combat, is now widely distributed amongst the Ukrainian armed forces. On the political side, Sir Michael Fallon was MP for Sevenoaks from 1997 to 2019 and an MP for Darlington for 9 years before that. A series of ministerial posts, mostly in the Treasury with the odd bit of business, certainly fitted him out to go and deal with that great high-spending department, the Ministry of Defence, where his most senior post was as the Secretary of State for Defence from 2014 to 2017, where he too wrestled with the political elements of this. I remember it very well at the time being his Director of Operations when we looked at how we would conduct operations in Mosul and Raqqa. I can think of no two better people to discuss this morning what is going on in Gaza, urban warfare, and what the lessons might be for conflict and for the politics of warfare going forward. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Ed, and good afternoon, everybody, and a pleasure to be here, and a particular welcome, if I can repeat it, to Professor Spencer for giving us the opportunity to draw on his expertise and indeed his study of previous conflicts. And that's, I think, where I'd like to start. Obviously, Gaza is in our minds. The intensity of that conflict, I think, has struck everybody and the media interest in it. Perhaps we could, though, just go slightly back and ask you, how different is Gaza? Is it actually very different to previous urban conflicts of this kind? Or is it just one in a series of conflicts like this since the Second World War, where everything has got a bit sharper, a bit more intense? How different is it?
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks for having me, and thank you, sir. I think that's a great question, and the problem is that humans need frameworks in which to hold their ideals. Even if they're military experts, you have to really look at what framework, and since I've had the liberty of studying this type of combat, I can say, not anecdotally, but through research, that there hasn't been anything like this since World War II. And even battles of World War II, which, whether it's the Battle of Manila, Stalingrad, or others, still pales in differences to what's happened, or the context of the war in Gaza, especially the actual military challenges, but also the political challenges of, this is Israel, this is the Israel-Palestine, the 15 years of preparation by Hamas to establish a defensive framework in which actually uses all the modern laws of war and everything. I don't know if you want me to go through the different contexts of why it's different, but it's really uniquely different. It is an evolution, of course. Historians will say like this, none of this is new. Whether it's, I get that a lot, like Roman times of a runner going back and telling the Senate what's going on in the war. But there are some very, I think, unique features to the war in Gaza that we haven't seen. Even in World War II, it still would be different.
I'd like to press you on that a little, because it's still not quite clear whether it's not because it's being watched more closely.
Yeah.
We have accounts of Stalingrad published long after the war,
Yeah.
but we didn't have accounts at the time. Nobody really knew exactly how that battle was being fought,
Yeah.
and certainly, the court of public opinion wasn't perhaps as relevant then as it is now. Is it that this conflict is being watched much more carefully, or is it this combination of new techniques and new weapons?
So I think it's all of the above. So I think it is, of course it is the evolution of the TikTok wars, what we were calling wars really 20 years ago, if not 10 years ago, of this ability to see into wars, as in war is always a contest of will, our population's ability to see into the war. Of course, Ukraine war showed that highly, where you can have a live feed of war and then be making your assessments and polling your citizens about how they think it's going. That's of course a factor of this war, and the immediacy of it. Like you said, that's not new, but the immediacy of the information from the battlefield, but also an immediacy of being able to make a judgment call on what they're seeing, where the whole world can watch a single clip now and go, I know exactly what's happening. And that's influencing massive amounts of political instability in everybody's countries. That's there, of course, but I still think that it's an evolution of things that have been in the past, like the first Battle of Fallujah, which the U.S. military was told to enter 2 battalions to a city of 300,000. Because of videos or photos, really, just a few photos being uploaded from the hospital, the entire battle was stopped. The U.S. military was defeated 6 days into that battle. That, what I would call the first Battle of Fallujah effect, we're seeing in Gaza, but it ties into underlying Western ideals of war. It ties into the ideal that if you bomb less, there'll be less civilian damage, which actually has been an evolution, and I've been a part of that, the groups that have been pushing that in time, but it's a vortex of all of this in a single place that I think has created something new.
And where has that come from, that focus on the necessary casualties of urban conflict? Where has that concern grown from?
Really from this evolution of, in my mind, my opinion, an evolution of human rights, anti-war, peace dividend, human rights activism gaining influence on nations, whether that's groups like Amnesty International, Red Cross, a lot of people who actually don't want any harm in wars at all, but they were the same groups, and I can show in every urban battle specifically, because that's where all the laws of war, all these Western and very moral sense of not wanting civilians harmed, not wanting innocents to be harmed because of 2 warring factions. All those groups have been forming and having influence and influencing national policies, especially United Nations, even NATO. It's been an evolution of those groups, same groups that were saying during every urban battle of recent times, Mosul, Raqqa, Aleppo, Mawari, all accusing Western powers of war crimes, you're indiscriminately bombing, Amnesty International during the opening days of a few months into the Ukraine war, put out a paper saying it's illegal to be in urban areas in war. That was their position. So I've seen this growing through these good intentioned groups, but they've gained in power and authority to where, like in the Gaza war, that's who's being referenced. Well, according to the United Nations, there could be war crimes here. According to this group, there's more bombs being dropped. According to this group, it's been an evolution of these groups, good intentioned and oftentimes uninformed, but gaining real influence on political decisions.
I'm sure we'll come to the appropriateness of the laws of armed conflict perhaps a little later on, and I'm sure there'll be questions on that. But I want to push you just a little further on the current battle in Gaza. To what extent is this, if you like, external media intensity is actually affecting the strategy on either side?
Well, I think it is. We go through centers of gravity, which is a term dubious in military theory. Like, what's the center of gravity of either side's power or associated to their strategy? The media, of course, has been the primary aspect of the strategy of Hamas. This international perception of what's going on. Hamas, just like every enemy of every generation, has watched the world, has watched wars, and have designed their strategy to a certain end that they want to achieve. The Hamas strategy relies on international pressure on Israel. It relies on that international pressure being built through international media and being able to influence populations, mainstream media, to get to their objective, which is, of course, just that Israel would have to stop, like it did after the Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War. Almost every battle of self-defense that Israel has fought, somebody has stepped in and said, okay, you need to stop the war. Hamas' strategy relies on international media. Israel's strategy, of course, knowing that war is a contest of will, depends on the narrative, because the United States, it could not fight its wars without the United States. That's pretty much a clear thing. It relies on it, but it's not a inherent part of their strategy, not political or military. For Hamas, the international media is the strategy.
And is Hamas pursuing that because it believes Israel is more vulnerable as a democracy?
100%. It's more vulnerable because it's a democracy. It's more vulnerable because it's dependent on other democracies. It's dependent on, it's a small nation. I mean, by fact, it's a small nation with limited military capabilities. So, I mean, just whether there is actually a guy named Sun Tzu or not, attack your enemy's strategy, then attack his allies, and then attack his military. So Hamas is putting forth a strategy where it knows that Israel relies on external support to survive.
But Israel is surviving. So is the strategy working in that sense, that Israel has been able to sustain this operation without its politics collapsing? If there is an election, it'll be later on. Without its economy being unable to bear the strain, and is degrading Hamas's military capabilities. So in that sense, is the strategy working?
So that's the interesting question is, it has worked in some ways, but the ultimate answer to that will be on what happens. Is Hamas able to survive the war? Then its strategy worked. Hamas doesn't need to maintain, matter of fact, it's one of the few enemies in the history of war where it does not deploys a human shield strategy, which is not new to terrorists or even enemy combatants to use human shields, but Hamas has a strategy which it doesn't care how much of its own citizens die. So the ultimate test on whether they achieve victory is not yet. I can show you in up to this point, it has worked to limit the IDF uniquely. This is kind of you don't want to be callous, is that really the world owns some of the harm that has been created in Gaza, because the IDF in Israel listened to the world and said, the way you're doing it in October, in November, you can't continue. You need to use less forces, less bombs, less civilian casualties, less destruction. So they decreased. They started with 5 divisions. They went to 4 divisions, 3, 1, 0. That prolonged the war. That has allowed Hamas to continue a strategy of survival, hostage negotiations, possibility not even doing a southern Gaza. So the answer of, has it worked yet? I could say it has worked to reduce the IDF. It has not worked. The IDF has continued to figure out a way to destroy Hamas's military capability. But the ultimate answer on who did it work, well, that depends on what happens.
And does that derive from the preparedness of Hamas, that they really thought through this strategy? Or is it simply the asymmetry when they're not a democracy and they're taking on a democracy?
That's a good question. I haven't had a chance to interview anybody in Hamas yet. I just got back in February where I was in Khan Yunis. I might have saw from a distance, but they definitely prepared for 15 years for this war. Some people would argue that they miscalculated and this wasn't a part of their plan, but they seem to have branches and sequels to prepare for this, to include that vast tunnel network, billions of dollars to build something that the world has never seen. I think, not just as a military tactician, just as a student of war, what Hamas invested in for this strategy is unique. I mean, China has a very vast underground network. North Korea has a vast, all for protection. But nobody's really seen somebody spend billions of dollars to build an infrastructure under civilian areas for the sole purpose of pursuing this strategy. Sometimes I don't like to give terrorists credit. It has led to its survival up to this point, and at times where the United States specifically and other nations have said, you should stop, which is the Hamas strategy. So I think they did prepare very well. I mean, I'm sure they had lots of advisors like everybody else does on best military advice to the Hamas political wing on what will work in these various scenarios. But thus far, to include, I think, counting for nations that they didn't account for, like Egypt. The fact that Egypt would refuse to open its borders to refugees, I don't know if they accounted for that, but it definitely played into their strategy.
So how strong does a democracy have to be able to resist that kind of international pressure?
I mean, so this gets to whether the narrative is right that this was an actual existential threat to a democracy, which I argue it was, and most people will say, okay, fine, October 7th was an existential threat to Israel. Israel has had to stand alone a bunch of times in its history, and has done things that nobody thought that was possible. I actually asked this question when I was last on ground, is could Israel fend off Hezbollah in the north without the United States' support? Could Israel, again, because its strength is not just its military powers, it's its allies, could it fight back a Hezbollah attack in the north without the United States? And the answer is unequivocally no, it could not. So that means they have a lot of military strength, and I think the attack by Iran on April 14th recently was an example of both their military strength, their defensive capabilities, and the strength of their allies. What's strong enough? But you definitely have to have all factors of military strength, political will, which at times we could argue has wavered. Yep. Despite the existential threat, the internal political will of Israel as a nation at times seemed to be teetering, as in the population being influenced by the same mass media that I think a lot of people are, that there's another way to achieve even bringing the hostages home. I don't know what the right variable is to test the strength, to measure the strength of a democracy.
Are there other examples of a democracy fighting against either a theocracy or an autocracy in this kind of way and losing?
Yeah, I mean, you could point to Ukraine if you wanted to talk about the debate of all war is a contest of will, your strength is your allies. It has seemed, this is, I got in an argument with a couple of people on this platform called X. I don't know if you do that, sure. To include with Elon Musk, who is trying to put rationale on war, and especially a war of a democracy, wedded in freedom as a goal. And he said it makes no sense for Ukraine to fight back at this point. It makes no sense that they would attack Russian defensive lines. I shot back, which I'm sure under that rationale, the United Kingdom should have gave up in 1940 because it didn't make sense to fight for freedom at that point. It meant you should negotiate. And this is people that really try to think through, like, what is strength? Democracies are their nation. They are their values. And you can put reason on fighting for your values, but that is a great example of the world in a democracy struggling to maintain its survival, the survival of a democracy. History should teach a lesson to everybody, but these are the same voices that were in all those historic moments saying it makes no sense to continue to fight.
But if your own existence is threatened, you do fight.
Which we live in a world where we can make an argument like, yeah, but this is almost the rocket, what I call the rocket appeasement strategy that happens in Israel. Yeah, they're launching, I mean, there's 4,000 rockets launched in the opening hours of October 7th against Israel, overwhelming its air defenses in many cases. In the 2006 Second Lebanon War, there were 4,000 rockets launched over 5 weeks. But because of this rocket appeasement strategy, the world wants to say, like, yeah, but you can, that's not a true threat to your survival. You can knock most of those down. I think we saw that again recently with Iran attacking Israel, but the world's saying, yeah, but you knocked down 99% of it. It's nothing. Like, in what world do we live in where that's not a threat to somebody's survival? Like, you tried to cause massive amount of destruction and damage on my sovereign nation. I call it problematic.
Okay, let me go back to something you referred to a little earlier on, which are the international laws accepted by the international community of armed conflict. How do they stand now, given the intensity of what we're seeing in a very, very densely packed urban environment like Gaza? Do those laws need adjusting or reviewing?
So I have a friend in the audience who's a law of war expert. So I've had to become an expert because of urban warfare, where the laws of war get put to the most test. Because especially if you look at post-World War II, Geneva Conventions, Fourth Geneva Convention, and the evolution, the law of war evolves. I absolutely do not think that we need to change it. There's new laws. We have a real big problem on understanding what the law says. Like I said, where you had an entire organization made up of thousands of lawyers who try to say it's a law of war violation to be in an urban area. Well, that's not a problem in the law of war. That's a problem interpreting the law of war, in making the world believe that there's so many of the in the urban areas that become myth, like you can't use white phosphorus, you can't drop this type of munition, and all these things. I think we have a crisis of understanding the laws of war. I think I want all sides to follow the laws of war, and they're actually very clear. They actually account for even this. Is that a combatant, a legal combatant? Is this an internationally armed conflict or a non-internationally armed conflict? What does it mean in these cases? I think from everything I've seen, even in urban combat where they get put to the test, it's very clear. But now we're in a point in our history where people, like in the International Court of Justice, is trying to be convinced that, yeah, but the law of war should be effects-based. And that's where we're coming into a place where people are looking at what they see in war and saying, yeah, but that's wrong, right? Like that's a war crime. Like, no, it's actually very in accordance with the law of war. And people are struggling who don't understand the law of war, saying like that's a violation and that needs to be investigated. Like, that's not how the law of war works on purpose. It's almost like a constitution or some framework that accounts for this complexity, and people just don't understand anything on what it says. It's not the effects of war that determine whether it was a violation. It's the act, the intention, all of those things that come into play. But we have a crisis in our world where people are being convinced that the law of war says something different, and I think it will, I know we're going to get to this, sir, I think it will have huge implications. Really, like your ability to defend your democracy when we live in a world where people are convincing masses of people that you just shouldn't conduct the war because of the fact that there might be damage, there might be all of these things. No, I don't think that we need more laws of war.
Well, it may be there are views on that, as whether the laws of war, and we have practitioners, I think, in our audience, as whether the laws of armed conflict really are as clear-cut, I wouldn't use the word simple, but as clear-cut as you're making out. Has there not always been an element of subjectivity about what is proportionate or what is necessary?
There has to be. This is the ideal that you could create some rule that says, objectively, like if this is the number, right? So there is the law of war. Of course, it's to guide the brutality of war. It's meant to put limits on the brutality of war, but it's never meant to be objectively written down. So where you can get if A equals B, then C. Like proportionality, which is always subjective to the military advantage in which that action, the calculation of the known collateral damage, that allows, I think it's brilliantly written, but now we've faced a world where people want objective standards. Like, well, there is 30,000 civilians. That, of course, means that you've created you're violating the law of war. Like, no, that's not what it means at all. The law of war, because it guides human function, has to have objectivity to it. Or subjectivity, I'm sorry, subjectivity.
Subjectivity, sure. But can they, reasonably be applied in such a densely packed urban environment?
Absolutely.
With modern weapons?
Absolutely.
They can.
They can. And this is, again, the paradox, like everything from collateral damage assessments. Like, of course, the military wants to never fight in an urban area. That's why I have job security. That's because whether it's the British Army or the U.S. Army or the British military, the real underlying thesis is avoid and bypass urban combat at all costs. Because once you enter that environment, there's more restrictions on the use of force than any other environment. There's more influence on your populations in this whole information domain. But the law isn't environment specific. The laws of war are very clear and even account for, protected populations, protected objects, all these things until they're, but this is where we've gotten to, is that the laws of war in urban areas are very clear. They're so clear that an enemy like Hamas, for the first time in history, can use every law of war that's created to its advantage, which goes against the actual principle why the law is there, is to put limit on warring factions. But we've created not just the laws, but now all these institutions who try to use the law for their authority. Hamas, whether they did it intentionally, probably with a lot of help from state-backed actors, designed an environment in which the laws of war would be the biggest issue. But I think they're very clear in urban combat.
I wonder about that, and I'm sure there'll be questions about that. I remember how we wrestled. I think Stringer and I wrestled with this in Mosul. Clearly, Daesh were using hospitals, we're using mosques, we're putting fighters on the top of buildings where there were large numbers of civilians.
Yeah, they're trying to create. I mean, that's the human shield strategy. That's what they call lawfare, where you use the law against you. It causes a Western liberal moral dilemma. It isn't a legal question that gets answered. It's a moral question of, well, what's the military advantage of that action? But we're getting into a world where literally the United States administration recently said that the appropriate number of civilian casualties is 0. Well, that means that there's no operation. When you lead yourself, and matter of fact, I can talk about the U.S. military because there's new language that says in civilian harm mitigation, you have to make a decision on not if it's legal, but have you done everything possible, and is it necessary? Which gets you into the necessity clause of law of war. But we're getting to the point like they faced in Mosul on many tactical questions of, well, don't strike, don't do that action. Not because of the legal aspect of it. Clearly, it's a military target. You know what the collateral damage will be, which gets into the factor again to the military advantage. Why, for me, Gaza is such a vignette of the trajectory of democracies, is that you have a democracy that's under legitimate existential threat in real time, being attacked in the north, being attacked daily from the south. And it's not a question of can they do something, but it's more of a moral question of should they do something about it? Should they act at all?
Are you concerned that we may see in the next few months a ruling from an international court that what Israel is doing in Gaza is contrary?
Well, that's interesting, since the ICJ has made rulings in the past that didn't have that much significance, and that other nations haven't listened to, like Russia needs to stop its illegal invasion of Ukraine. I think it would be. There's lots of things happening that I think are problematic, and they're moments in time. Yes, if the ICJ came back, already they have done. It has done immense damage and I don't think people acknowledge this, that it has done immense damage, not on what it's ruled on, but the fact that it listened to the South American case. It made a ruling in which could be warped in interpretation on there's plausible sense that South Africa does have jurisdiction to enter this into the court. Like, that had immense damage on a war in real time. You could argue on whether that was the intent. I'm not scared on what the ICJ is, because I have a little bit, and I'm not a lawyer, I know a little bit of what the law says. It would, if it came out with some radical ruling that the effects of Gaza, Israel's war, no matter what it's done, and you've probably seen my writings that it's taken more steps in the history of war to prevent civilian casualties, to prevent genocide. If somehow the ICJ came out and said, that may be the case, but the results of the operation mean something, mean X, Y, and Z, they could create a legal precedence that would, of course, affect any Western military's ability to fight a war in general. But I just know how loose the facts versus what's been said are, and that everything has really been taken out of real understanding of what the law of war says.
But the case is there now, so there will be a ruling, presumably, one way or the other, in a few months' time.
Yep. It could be. And again, I think it matters most to nations like the United States, United Kingdoms, who put their values as high as the legal aspects of these multinational organizations that were created to prevent the very things that have been happening before this war, whether it's the Syrian war, genocide in Rwanda, the UN Security Councils. It is a test, and I think this is, again, where people like you and I were talking about, nobody recognizes that the Battle of Mosul was the biggest battle since World War II, the biggest urban battle since World War II, and that the Second Battle of Fallujah was the biggest battle in the entire Iraq War, irrelevant of what happened even in the Battle of Baghdad. Those two wars were the biggest since World War II. I think we're living in a time that is the biggest test of our democracies and our multinational organizations that we created to maintain our way of life. That includes the United Nations, NATO, ICJ, ICG. Like, it's the biggest test. Whether we recognize we're in that test or not, we're definitely, I firmly believe we're in that moment in time.
Well, we're going to open it up in a moment, and Stringer will come up here and share some questions. But let me finish by just asking you what follows from that. If that is true, if this is the test, this is then a war of perception in the end, as much as a real war.
Absolutely, where the perception of the use of force is more important than what is actually happening on the ground, 100%. We've seen that in battles before, and this is, again, like the framing of this, whether you frame this as a counterterrorism, a counterinsurgency operation, what is this not? You framed it as war. You framed it as an existential threat or an event. I think those framings really matter to where these perceptions can be warped. This is Sun Tzu, defeat your enemy without fighting. We're living in a world where that's being put into real reality because of the ability for information to reach our populations, because of the misunderstandings of what's happening on the ground. Really, it's the reverse. We think we have more access to war when we actually have less, because we're looking through a soda straw, and then that can be interpreted by massive farm bots or Russian disinformation agents, all this, to mean something. I don't know how to put the right wording on it, but it absolutely matters where perception becomes more important than actions.
Thank you. Now, Ed Stringer will, I think, invite some questions.
I'm already picking up hands in the audience, and we'll come straight to Andrew Roberts. Could I just thank you both for an incredibly stimulating conversation that covers some incredibly important ground. I knew I wouldn't have to do that thing about chair's privilege to steal the first question, and I'm going to open it up to the floor. So name and organisation you're representing here, if appropriate, please. Lord Roberts.
Andrew Roberts. I'm a historian. Will the attack on Rafa, assuming it happens, be qualitatively different from any of the other battles in Gaza, such as the one in North Gaza at the beginning of the campaign?
Well, thanks, sir, and I'm a great fan of your work. I just interviewed General Petraeus last week. I think it will be drastically different. I think this has been the failure of the world to recognize that operations in northern Gaza at the start of the war were vastly different than operations in central Gaza, different than the Battle of Khan Yunis, which I was at last month. The operations in Rafa, because of the density of the population, because of the preparation of the world to watch the operation once it starts. This is, again, I've been studying urban combat for over a decade academically. And every time I've gone to Gaza, I've had my mind blown on what's happening on the ground, as in the steps being done to prevent civilian harm in a real combat situation. And in Khan Yunis, one of the things that blew my mind was how they were taking the advantage away from the enemy. And one of the advantages of the enemy is this perception war, where the world can perceive something's happening, although it's not. How in Khan Yunis, like I said, that all the amount of force being used, 4 divisions down to 1 division doing an operation, was because the world said you needed to do it differently, still achieving your military goals. So I think a southern Gaza, so Rafa City, Rafa refugee camp, in other areas of southern Gaza will look drastically different than northern Gaza. One, the enemy threat is different. They don't have as much coherent military battalions in dense subterranean environments. Matter of fact, the ideal of one of the reasons that where most of the civilian population is in that southwestern corner of Gaza, the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone was picked because it didn't have tunnels before the war. Most intelligence, although they've been surprised in every element. So I think, absolutely, sir, I think the southern Gaza operation that is about to begin will look drastically different, and I think it will even surprise me. And one example I'll give, is tactics, but it's also in perceptions, is that in one area of Khan Yunis, the division commander that I walked around with had launched 4 brigades in the middle of the night to surround an urban area, which still had its civilian population in it. So they didn't do the evacuation first. They launched it, didn't fire a single shot, and then called for evacuations through them, which is very dangerous, and used facial recognition to pick out all the Hamas leaders, over 900 of them, who were trying to flee with the civilians like they had been this whole time. That was a different way to do it, still maintaining all the principles of military tactics that we hold true. So absolutely different.
Would you in which case I'll come down to this gentleman here, and then I've got you all in order. Thank you.
Yeah, Henry Robinson, Google Ideas Against Violent Extremism. I was very taken by your comments about Hamas. I think something similar with Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin during the hunger strikes of 1981, where it benefited Sinn Féin to let the hunger strikers die. We've got a lot of testimonies to that. So their political organisation grew out of that. Same thing is happening here in relation to Hamas. They're winning politically. And the guys in Qatar don't give a damn about the guys in Rafa and the rest of it, right? Because they're winning. Their objectives are winning, and thanks to everybody else, they're winning. My point is this. When the pogrom was carried out on October 7th, even before Israel went to war, we had the calls for a ceasefire. We've got a group in UK who've been here for quite a while, Palestine Solidarity Campaign, 100,000 people in the streets every week. But you go back 4 or 5 years and you'll see this group, their demonstrations are fairly constant, calling, naming what's going on in Israel and further afield for genocide, apartheid. They infiltrated a lot of Jew hate inside the UK, and very big pals of Hamas. So in relation to political warfare, I think they've been brilliant. I just wonder what your view on political warfare and what they've done.
Sure. So one, I'll say about October 7th that has surprised me, even as my perception of what happened on October 7th before walking the ground. Despite what the mass media, Israel, I watched the 45-minute video, I still had no comprehension of the scale and severity of what happened on October 7th. How far they breached, how many sites they reached, the intentions. I think that despite the amount of attention that was given and people have forgotten, I think the world still had a misunderstanding of what happened on October 7th. And I only got that through going and visiting and walking the ground and really trying to piece it together. And I'm still not all there to include on how did it continue, all of this stuff. But on their winning part, this goes back, sir, to your question about, are they winning? They have definitely had successes on the battlefield of information, 100%. And they'll try to tap in, they have tried, whoever they are, to every narrative which they think will stick the best. Apartheid, blockade, open air prison, the numbers. They have tried, but that hasn't, it has changed the IDF approach and Israel approach to include timing. This is why I think the world owns some of the suffering in Gaza, because the fastest way to defeat your enemy is through speed and violence of action. And had the world wanted the IDF to slow down, they wanted them to change their tactics, all of this stuff, that was a Hamas win. It bought them more time. Their only objective is to survive. But now they're in a very small corner of southern Gaza. They've lost 75% of their combat power, most of their military capabilities, arguably disconnected from the political wing. To say they're winning, they have had successes. The ultimate answer of whether they won or not is yet to be had. We have faced, in my personal, very risky positions of, what are we saying here? We're saying they're going to win. But they have uniquely, which I think we all should be learning from, been able to tap into, and then you can actually see them change their tactics, whoever they are. I was fighting against an ideal that people were dying of thirst in Gaza, which just wasn't true. And to where the IDF have had to respond to the counterfactual. So when the world thought that there were people dying of thirst, the IDF and other nations had to respond to that and flood potable water into an area that didn't have potable water before. But in that, you saw them switch to, okay, that's not working, so they switched to a different topic. So 100% under food insecurity, and then all of our governments parrot what's actually false. It's a good warning to whether it's governments or militaries on having to fight in this narrative and the speed of it, right? Where those moments that they've had were sometimes actually because of the response to the moment wasn't quick enough. Like this is the bombing of the hospital early in the war, where a bomb from a terrorist organization, not Hamas, in Gaza, launched a rocket because 10% of the 12,000 rockets that have emanated out of Gaza have landed and killed a lot of civilians in Gaza. Landed in a parking lot, and it'll be a case study for militaries and governments around the world on how fast that Churchill lie traveled the world before the truth put his pants on, before he even woke up. That's a really good case study of them and this information war. But I wouldn't say they're winning. They've had moments.
Well, just to reflect on Sinn Féin, I think it's worth reflecting on that. Sinn Féin haven't yet been able to force Northern Ireland into the Irish Republic. That hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? I think partly because of the skill and courage of our armed forces who fought that war for 30 years. Partly because eventually the government was able to stop them winning the battle of international opinion by cutting off some of their supply of arms and to some extent money. And partly also, I think, because the successive British governments were pretty clear that these were terrorists. They weren't anything else, anything other than terrorist. And there was a fairly clear political line maintained by successive governments right from the start. But worth thinking about.
Right, I've got 7 more people lined up, and that's 2 minutes each for question and answer. So down to the gentleman at the front.
Frank Gardner, BBC security correspondent. Professor, defenders of the IDF strategy in Gaza, which I think probably does not include your president because he was increasingly strident in his criticism. They've often said Israel had no choice; it had to do it this way. Based on your own military expertise, your own experience in Fibio in fighting in built-up areas, Is there an alternative? Could it have done this better with fewer casualties? Because there's no question, there's no doubt that, you know, prior to the Iranian missile attack, which was a bit of a gift to Israel actually in terms of PR, I mean, obviously it was horrific if it had succeeded, but Israel was losing the PR war up till then because of the very high casualties and the humanitarian things. Could the IDF have done it differently?
So I actually wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed recently to counterbalance the recommendations the IDF were getting on October 8th. So the U.S. administration sent advisors to the IDF on early in with recommendations on how it could be done. As in, if we all recognize that the Israel's legitimate policy objectives were return the hostages, destroy Hamas's military capability to do on October 7th again, and secure its borders. Could it have done it differently than it did in northern Gaza in the beginning of the operation? Could it have waited longer, since it waited 3 weeks to conduct the operation to evacuate 850 of the million civilians in the north? Could they use less bombs, which goes back to my narrative? That's really, so I argue that the one other alternative that has been propositioned from former U.S. Secretaries of Defense to former general officers has been they could have done it by doing small unit operations and surgical strikes. The raid, I call it the zero dark 30 fallacy. I argue academically that that's about as false as you can get, but it could have been a strategy had Israel been okay with all of its hostages staying in captivity indefinitely. Because any other military strategy accounts for time. This is that ideal that it was a counter-terror ideal and put on top of the framework of war. Would the United States, the question I'm going to answer soon is, would the United States have done it differently? I think the United States would have done it a lot differently. I think it would have went in stronger, with more force, to end the war quicker and achieve its goals of bringing its hostages home, making the rockets stop raining down. I mean, just the rockets. If somebody was bombing us from outside of our territory, I guarantee we'd stack every bomber in our inventory above that place until the rockets stop raining down. And they're all legitimate military targets. It wouldn't be indiscriminate at all. Very precision until every rocket stopped raining down. This is acknowledgement. There's been 12,000 rockets. I think the U.S. would have done it a lot differently. And this goes back to my, if you think there's a different way, history doesn't support it. And if you are propositioning, this, I guarantee there were people, whether they're policy or military experts, giving different advice. And in fact, some gave it to Israel, like, don't go into Gaza. You'll lose the will of the people. You'll lose too many soldiers. But the alternative was leave your citizens in captivity, maintain the existential threat to your survival on your border. Oh, by the way, Hezbollah's attacking in the north. I strongly believe, based on my research, that there was another way, and it would have looked differently than the way Israel did it. But the way the IDF did it was the most efficient way to do it while still preventing as much civilian harm as possible. And history doesn't support the idea that if I really get pushed on people, especially in news, like Fareed Zakaria or somebody like that who's taken their advice from different generals, well, we just wouldn't bomb that much. So I had a Secretary of Defense, former U.S. Secretary of Defense, say, we would never have bombed Kabul that much. I'm like, well, if we would have had 240 of our hostages in Kabul, had Al-Qaeda been willing to die inside, it had a tunnel network, all these things, I guarantee we would have bombed it as much. Or the idea that if we would have just not bombed, there would be less civilian casualties, which again, history doesn't support. No battle in history says, matter of fact, MacArthur would not allow the U.S. military to use air power in the Battle of Manila and the Battle of Seoul in 1950. And hundreds of thousands of civilians still died. Because it's war. It's the nature of the enemy combatant in the environment who is willing to die.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I think the answer was supposed to be short, but...
Well, I think you covered it. So now I'm going to take two then quickly. So I'm going to ask you for quick questions and we'll get quick answers. So at the back, the lady, the woman on the right, my right, and then the gentleman on her right. Two questions, quick questions. I'll take them, the questions at the same time. And then I'm coming to the rest. So please, Name and organisation.
Hi, Sarah from KBR. My question is, what areas of capabilities do you think warrant deep industry engagement?
Thank you. Nice and crisp. And can we take the second question at the same time, please?
Thank you. Robert Clark from Civitas. Like you, Professor, I'm a former soldier who fought in Iraq. And I study warfare. Regarding the information warfare side of this, just very briefly, obviously the pro-Palestine movement and Hamas have exploited huge, enormous weaknesses in sort of liberal democracies, such as in Britain and Western Europe. What more can Israel, and in particular here in Britain, Western Europe, and America, do to counter the information warfare narrative that Hamas and the pro-Palestine movement have sought to exploit so overwhelmingly? Thank you.
So on the first question, it was what could industry invest in better?
Yeah, essentially.
So that's pretty open. I'm a land power guy, so I have some ideas on different tools and techniques like bulldozers. I mean, people in my world, in my study, think that again that there's another way, and I have argued for years that if you want to reduce civilian casualties, bring a bulldozer and a tank. Because in the dense urban combat, which is why combat has evolved to urban areas, is exactly because of what has happened in Gaza. Because of the perceptions of the use of force, because it doesn't matter what type of bomb you have, I don't care what it is. There's something called the precision paradox. Like, one, people thought, this whole 50% dumb bombs narrative, which it's so wrong for many reasons. But the idea that if you had 100% precision guided munitions, every bomb you dropped in combat was a precision guided munition, that you would lead to less destruction. Again, it's not proven, actually, it's actually disproven in Mosul, where the US military, with all its resources, ran out of Hellfire missiles because it was precisely trying to engage a target one building at a time. I would say invest in bulldozers and tanks. You could argue, if you're in that industry, invest in this information, which bleeds into your topic, like what could Israel have done in the information operations domain. I think a lot. And I'm not pro anything. I'm actually pro fact. And the fact that I had to go into Gaza, into Khan Yunis, to know how the IDF was doing the operation differently than it had in northern Gaza. How it was self-restricting itself, not just handing out its own maps, which they tweeted about, but how they were identifying entire areas as no-go areas, could not, unless the prime minister authorized you to cross that line. Like, all of that is a failure in informing the world to counteract this narrative that you're just intentionally trying to cause destruction, intentionally trying to kill civilians. There will be a lot to be learned about, governments, especially democracies, adhering to the free, basically their values, want to control information rather than fight in the narrative. They want to, they limit the amount that the IDF says. They take away their cell phones. I don't know what the right answer is, but the fact that I had to go into this combat to say these things to the world, great, it's job security for me, but it's a failure in one side's ability to articulate what's actually happening. You could argue that one of these is the IDF's refusal to embed journalists, right? So the IDF does not do media embeds like the US military or other Western militaries did. Matter of fact, that's the biggest difference between the first Battle of Fallujah, and I guess these are battles, not war. The first Battle of Fallujah and the second Battle of Fallujah, first Battle of Fallujah, 0 media embeds. Second Battle of Fallujah, just 6 months later, 60 media embeds. Because this is in this information operations domain. If you recognize it as the highest priority of the war, pursuing the political objective, is this transparency. If you have 0 media embeds, then that means you need to account for the fact that the world doesn't know what you're doing.
Could I just come to Michael on that view?
Well, I agree with that. I think Israel simply has to respond, by improving the transparency of what it's doing, and embeds is certainly one route towards that.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman in the grey, and then the woman with the green jacket after that. Yeah, 2 questions, please.
Is this working? Professor, Simon Sebag Montefiore. I'm a historian, and I just wanted to ask you this is a slightly multifaceted question. The first part of it is, you mentioned that that different parts of this campaign were fought in different ways. withdrawing doesn't seem to have worked in the sense that Hamas forces have moved back into the hospital and Al-Shifa hospital and other areas. What should they do next? Secondly, a question on the information question. One of the ways that Hamas has been particularly successful is controlling the casualty numbers. What do you think are the real casualty numbers? Thirdly, how do you analyze Israeli military discipline during this campaign among the ordinary soldiers? And the last one, a practical one, how would you complete this campaign? Well, that's quite a few questions, but I think you have the acumen. I think you have the acumen to handle this.
We do have to get people. So you're quite at liberty to give very brief answers, as we had 4 questions.
Do you want the other question first?
We'll take the other one, please.
Natasha Hausdorff. I'm a barrister and I also serve as legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. In the circumstances, perhaps I'll just pick up, if I may, and emphasise the second of those excellent questions. In terms of the casualty count, you, Professor, also referenced that 33,000 figure. It seems, of course, this comes from the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health in Gaza. It seems even Hamas now alleges a far lower figure of 22,000. But that still remains a figure that doesn't distinguish between civilians and combatants. It doesn't indicate how these people have died. You've talked about Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas rockets falling short in the Gaza Strip. They kill indiscriminately. We've also had reports of Hamas shooting, bombing their own civilians. In those circumstances, do you see, and in light of this recent revision, do you see there being any feasible change with respect to that, the public's reaction to that figure, given that it's been so decisive in that perception that was discussed earlier? And thank you for your scholarship and thought leadership on this important issue.
Well, thank you. This is my friend that's an international law expert, Natasha, which I rely on a lot of her work for my own learning. So I'll start with the easy one, which is the casualty figure. Not easy one, of course, despite what the people that actually know is that there haven't been 33,000 civilian casualties, period. And the fact that nations have run with the number is the first in history as well. I've never seen a world in which the world runs with the number of a daily civilian casualty count down to the single digit without reasonable logic that would be impossible to achieve. Never been done in the history of war where you have a number on a daily basis in the middle of a battle and a war. Even if you want to question the legitimacy of who's providing the number. Again, there's nobody inside of Gaza collecting that number. It's a trust on whether you believe they're Hamas or not, the Gaza Health Ministry, and really picking apart the logical aspect of where are we getting this number, but the world ran with it. That's troublesome, and I agree that the number includes every death in Gaza. Even if I went with it, I'd have to convince everybody, like, do you understand this means every person who has died in Gaza since October 7th, whether of natural causes, of Hamas, PJI, Lion causes, every combatant, that number, if it was true, includes all of those, and that does have meaning for the assessment we're putting on. But I keep getting this question, like, what's the right number there? Like, nobody knows. Well, what's the right number, and isn't that too much? Well, now you're asking a moral question of, like, what is the right number? And then going back to our discussion on the objective versus subjectiveness of the law of war, proportionality, things like that, of, okay, but in the act of the decision of taking a military target, how much did collateral damage, and this is the myths and all of this stuff. I think, again, in recognizing, so the fact that we keep running with the number, with an October, November war time frame sentiment. So this is a failure for the world to recognize that the IDF, because the world said they had to, dropped the number of civilian casualties, despite the context of the enemy, in half before January, by 2/3 before February. By the time I visit them in February in Khan Yunis, there's really so low of a casualty count on actual military action that nobody's reporting it anymore. So I think in the next operation, back to the earlier question, is that there'll be a very low civilian casualty count, which means that the IDF will have to approach it very differently. It'll take longer. It'll put more of them at risk, which is what the world wants. There's many elements to that, but there is no number. This is like even in the Battle of Mosul, it was a year later before anybody could actually even configure a number where the mayor is saying it's 40,000, the United Nations saying it was around 11,000. But is this, so I think the greater question is in the next war, will the world expect, like, what's your civilian casualty count today? Like, how would I figure that out? Unless I had people sitting down on cameras counting and then being able to say, well, that's a combatant, that's a civilian. On the different ways, I think you highlight something that, if you haven't read General Petraeus and Sir Andrew Roberts' book, Conflicts, is a great example of that clear, hold, build mentality of even, after you've cleared an area, you have to hold, you have to build it. We're seeing, again, a nation with limited capabilities. What would it have taken to hold areas that you're currently clearing while being pressured by your greatest ally to reduce and get to the end of this as quickly as possible? So this gets to the idea that you think the IDF is all capable and it's making the decision not to do things because it, whatever intention. In order to have held northern Gaza, you'd have to, okay, deploy hundreds of thousands of troops, have a viable partner in which they can assist in maintaining the security environment, and then doing all these other things while also protecting yourself in the north as an army of 100,000 Hezbollah are attacking you. So withdrawing and this aspect of, if there isn't a plan, which there is, for holding and building and something else other than Hamas and Gaza, yeah, of course, those are going to rebuild themselves and continue to try to do military operations. And then the last one on the discipline. That's a great question and really problematic. Some recent news about my own government about to make a ruling about a military unit in the IDF from before this war. And to sanction a military unit, which would invoke a bunch of things. Soldiers, of course, make mistakes in war, and there are also even soldiers who do awful things in war. But a democracy that follows the law of war holds them accountable. For my own military, whether it's the My Lai massacre, the kill squads of Afghanistan, a book called Black Hearts, there are lots of situations where soldiers do really, Abu Ghraib, but you hold them accountable. And the discipline in which I saw in the IDF was that of my own military or the UK military, where soldiers follow the orders they're given. They have a moral code. They have an ethical code. We don't do that. And actually, again, this is my visit of, I saw things that they say, well, we don't do that, that were of the highest moral, ethical, legal framework that I've ever seen. So I think the discipline's high.
Sadly, I'll be the last to go. So a final thought from you, Sir Michael, and then I'll come back to you, John, briefly for just one final thought you'd want everyone to take out of the room.
No, I mean, there's so much here that's been covered. I think what has come across, is the difficulty for Israel in terms of the war of perception, and what more could have been done, and what more can still be done to try and turn that tide of international opinion. And certainly, probably more needs to be done to explain, what the current constraints are, fighting in an urban area, and how the law of armed conflict actually applies, and how clear-cut it actually is before you apply the various subjective tests.
Thank you very much. John, final word.
Yeah, final word. I'll answer the question that I didn't. How does this end? Which I think is on a lot of people's minds. I can't tell you how it ends, and if somebody can tell you they can predict the certainty of war, they haven't studied war. I can tell you definitively that if Hamas survives this war and maintains hold-up hostages, they have achieved victory. And it will have drastic implications for other democracies of the world who fight their next war.
Two very good points on which to end. We introduced this by saying this is a political and military discussion. I think 2/3 of the questions have been about the politics of it, and I'm sure many people thought we were going to be hearing about the tactics of urban warfare, which I think just reveals the reality of conflict as it's always been, but especially is today, when there is so much transparency. I remind it was Policy Exchange that tried to kick this off with its fog of law work a while ago. I would add, I think LOAC will be looked at in the light of this, and not least because Israel's using artificial intelligence at the moment to help it speed up the kill chain, and that's work where a lot of people are looking at it. And the final thought then on this is and maybe for later discussion, we haven't had time to get around to the broader geostrategic question, which is what part is this very high intensity conflict playing in a much broader press against the West at the moment, seeing as how it certainly helped Putin by taking people's eye off what he was doing in Ukraine and testing our resources as we spread them ever more thinly around the world. Maybe we could discuss that one on the next occasion. But such a dense, protein-rich discussion there. Some excellent questions from the audience. My apologies to the two people I couldn't get to at the end. Could I ask you please to thank our panellists for a fantastic discussion?